Before sunrise on December 7, 1941, the battleships moored at Pearl Harbor were almost perfectly still. Crews were just waking up, eating breakfast, and preparing for what they thought would be an ordinary, quiet Sunday. But, as we know, within hours that calm harbor was transformed into a chaotic field of shattered steel and burning oil. But what happened next? Where are all 8 of those Pearl Harbor battleships today? We're going to dig into the historical archives and follow the largely forgotten post-war fates of these incredible vessels. Plus a 9th, the target ship, Utah. Looking down from high above Battleship Row during the attack, the terrifying reality of that morning is undeniable. Now, the December 7th attack itself is one of the most famously documented moments in human history, but the aftermath, what actually happened to these specific ships in the years that followed, that's far less familiar. We all know the Arizona and the Oklahoma, but the subsequent stories of the California, Maryland, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, West Virginia, and the Utah, they often just fade into the background. To understand the complete story, we really have to look past the smoke of that initial strike. We have to start with the ship that became the absolute symbol of the attack, the USS Arizona. The damage here was truly catastrophic. An armor-piercing bomb completely penetrated her forward ammunition magazines, triggering an explosion that tore through the battleship with extraordinary force. 1,177 sailors and Marines were lost. The destruction was so absolute that raising her was never even considered a practical option. Her ruined hull was left exactly where it came to rest, and today it serves as a permanent tomb and a profoundly solemn memorial. But there is another ship lost that day that gets far less public attention, the USS Utah. As an older battleship that had been converted into a demilitarized target and training ship, she wasn't actually an intended target for the Japanese, but pilots struck her anyway in a tragic case of mistaken identity. The Utah rolled rapidly onto her side, taking 58 men down with her. Rescue crews desperately went to work, literally cutting directly through the overturned steel hull to save the sailors who were trapped in the darkness below. Over on Battleship Row, the USS Oklahoma suffered an incredibly swift and catastrophic capsizing. She rolled completely upside down in a matter of minutes, trapping 429 men inside. But unlike the Arizona or the Utah, the Navy actually decided to recover the Oklahoma's hull. Over a period of several agonizing months, using massive cables and winches installed over on Fort Island, they executed a monumental parbuckling salvage operation. Inch by inch, they managed to pull that immense, overturned hull back into an upright position. Despite that incredible engineering feat, the Oklahoma's ultimate fate carries a pretty grim irony. The damage was just too extensive to rebuild her, so she was stripped of her guns and her superstructure and eventually sold for scrap. In 1947, while being towed across the Pacific to a scrapyard in California, the completely powerless hull got caught in a severe storm. She started pulling her tugboats down with her. To save themselves, the crews had to cut the lines, and the Oklahoma slipped away to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. To this day, she has no known wreck site. Now, let's transition to the battleships that were successfully raised and rebuilt. The USS West Virginia sank upright, settling right onto the harbor bottom. She was heavily damaged, yes, but she was accessible. Meanwhile, the USS Tennessee was trapped inboard, essentially wedged against the mooring area by the sunken West Virginia. To survive the massive inferno around them, the Tennessee's crew actually fired up the ship's powerful propellers to physically push away the burning oil that was drifting across the surface of the water. Before we talk about the West Virginia's eventual resurrection, we really need to pause and honor what happened on her decks that morning. Admiral Chester Nimitz later awarded the Navy Cross to Doris Miller, a mess attendant on the West Virginia. Because the Navy was strictly segregated at the time, black sailors were restricted entirely to service roles. Yet, when the attack began, Miller helped move his fatally wounded captain and then manned a heavy anti-aircraft gun, a weapon he had zero formal training on. He fired until the ammunition was completely gone, becoming the first black American sailor ever awarded the Navy Cross. Returning to the broader fate of the fleet, the USS California faced a much slower, agonizing demise alongside Fort Island. Unlike the sudden catastrophic loss of the Arizona or Oklahoma, the California sank gradually. Torpedo damage allowed water to violently flood in, but her damage control teams fought a desperate, multi-day battle against the rising water and contaminated fuel systems, doing everything humanly possible to keep her afloat. Ultimately, she did settle onto the harbor bottom, but her crew's fierce resistance became absolutely legendary. That fierce resistance is perfectly encapsulated by machinist mate Robert Scott. He was manning an air compressor station that supplied vital air to the rest of the ship. As his compartment flooded and became extremely dangerous, others were ordered to evacuate immediately. Scott refused. He stated he would continue as long as his equipment could help the men depending on it. He stayed, he died at his post, and he was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his profound sacrifice. Sometimes, survival simply comes down to sheer positioning. Because the USS Maryland was moored inboard, the Oklahoma essentially acted as a massive shield, absorbing the torpedoes and protecting the Maryland from the worst of the underwater damage. Meanwhile, the USS Pennsylvania, which was the fleet flagship, was sitting in dry dock. She took a bomb hit, but being completely out of the water protected her from the deadly torpedo strikes. Both of these massive ships survived with comparatively limited harm, and both quickly returned to active duty. And returning to the fight is exactly what this fleet did. It all culminated in one of the most dramatic reversals of fate in naval history, the Battle of Surigao Strait, in October of 1944. Waiting in the pitch darkness for an advancing Japanese naval force were 5 of those rebuilt Pearl Harbor battleships: the West Virginia, Maryland, Tennessee, California, and Pennsylvania. Using advanced radar, they detected the enemy in the dark and completely annihilated the Japanese battle line. It was actually the last battleship versus battleship engagement in world history. The very ships that Japan tried to eliminate at Pearl Harbor essentially became their worst nightmare. Raised from the mud, the West Virginia, California, Tennessee, Maryland, and Pennsylvania underwent massive modernizations. We're talking widened hulls, advanced radar-directed fire control, and devastating anti-aircraft capabilities. They spent the rest of the war relentlessly bombarding enemy shores to support amphibious landings, surviving multiple kamikaze and torpedo strikes right up to the end of the conflict. But of all these incredible stories, perhaps no ship had a wilder journey than the USS Nevada. The Nevada was the only battleship to actually get underway during the December 7th attack. Moving under her own power made her an immediate, highly visible target, drawing intense enemy fire as Japanese pilots desperately tried to sink her in the main channel to block the entire harbor. To keep that crucial channel clear for the rest of the fleet, her crew intentionally ran her aground at Hospital Point. She absolutely earned her title as the unsinkable Nevada. After being refloated and fully repaired, the Nevada went on an incredible geographic journey. She left the Pacific entirely and sailed to Europe, where she fired her massive guns on German defenses during the D-Day landings at Normandy. Then she turned right around, sailed back into the Pacific theater, and bombarded Japanese positions at both Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The ship simply refused to quit. You might think peace would bring a quiet retirement for a ship like that. But in a very surreal twist of the new post-war atomic age, this battle-hardened veteran was painted a highly visible, bright orange. Why? Because in 1926, she was selected to be the central aiming point for Operation Crossroads. This was a series of nuclear tests out at Bikini Atoll, specifically designed to see exactly how naval vessels would withstand atomic explosions. During the apocalyptic Baker Blast, which was a massive underwater nuclear detonation, both the Nevada and the Pennsylvania were right there in the target fleet. The blasts lifted millions of tons of highly radioactive water, bathing both ships in a toxic spray. Incredibly, both of these indestructible veterans managed to stay afloat. However, they were so heavily contaminated with radiation that they couldn't be safely manned or maintained, which ultimately forced the Navy to tow them out into deep water and scuttle them. Meanwhile, the rest of our resurrected fleet faced much quieter, undramatic post-war endings. The West Virginia, California, Tennessee, and Maryland all survived the war, but the era of the battleship was rapidly coming to a close. Placed into reserve fleets, they were eventually all sold for scrap by the late 20th century. The massive steel leviathans that had literally fought their way back from the bottom of Pearl Harbor were quietly dismantled, effectively dissolving the physical fleet of December 7th. Which brings us to a battleship that wasn't even built when Pearl Harbor was attacked, the USS Missouri. It was right there on the deck of the Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, that Japanese representatives signed the formal surrender documents. The Missouri didn't suffer the opening shock of the conflict, but she proudly hosted its official conclusion, formally ending the Second World War. So, looking at the whole picture, where are they all today? The final tally is a stark reflection of a changing world. The Arizona and Utah remain exactly where they fell, serving as permanent solemn war graves. The Oklahoma vanished into the deep Pacific during a storm in 1947. The Nevada and Pennsylvania rest in the deep ocean, scuttled after the atomic tests, and the heroic West Virginia, California, Tennessee, and Maryland were all eventually sold for scrap after helping win the war. The legacy of Pearl Harbor leaves us with a truly haunting reality today. The USS Missouri, now preserved as a museum ship, is anchored just a few hundred yards from the wreck of the USS Arizona. Her bow is deliberately positioned so she forever watches over the sunken Arizona. The ship representing the end of the war looks toward the tomb representing its tragic beginning. As you think about the incredible journeys of the 8 battleships we've tracked today, consider the immense historical distance between those two hulls. Thank you for joining us to explore this profound piece of history.